Hey there, travelers. Before we dive into today's story, drop a comment below telling us where you're tuning in from. Now let's begin our journey into the unknown. The call came at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning that would change everything I thought I knew about reality. 9 years in the Air Force, countless crash investigations, and I believed I'd seen every way metal could fail and men could die. I was wrong. Ryder, get your team assembled. We have a situation in Kansas. Colonel Curry's voice carried that particular edge that meant this wasn't routine. Nothing about that morning felt routine from the moment my phone buzzed me awake in my base quarters at Offutt. 20 minutes later, I stood in the briefing room with my investigation team. Captain Sam Kelly, our by-the-book team leader, looked as alert as ever despite the early hour. Technical Sergeant Kath Cowan sat hunched over her communications equipment, already pulling preliminary data. Sergeant First Class David Grenny checked his ordnance disposal kit methodically, and Dr. Alan Gabion, our civilian aerospace engineer, studied satellite imagery with intense focus. Transport aircraft went down approximately 30 miles southeast of Topeka, Curry began, clicking through grainy photos on the projection screen. Initial reports suggest mechanical failure, but radar data shows some anomalies. Anomalies. In my experience, that word meant paperwork, headaches, and usually something the brass wanted buried quietly. "What kind of anomalies, sir?" Kelly asked.
Curry paused, his weathered face creasing. "Electromagnetic interference. Significant. Radar operators reported what they described as luminous interference, seconds before the aircraft disappeared from their screens." Cowan looked up from her tablet. "Weather conditions?" "Clear skies. No storm activity within 200 miles. Curry's tone suggested he didn't like this any more than we did.
"Your job is simple. Investigate the crash site, determine cause, recover the flight recorder, and file your report. Standard protocol." But his eyes told a different story. This wasn't standard anything. 4 hours later, our convoy rolled through Kansas farmland under an October sky the color of old steel. The landscape stretched endlessly flat, broken only by fence lines and the occasional farmhouse. I'd grown up in Nebraska, so this terrain felt familiar. Comfortable even. That comfort wouldn't last long. "Approaching the coordinates now," Cowan reported from the passenger seat, her radio crackling with static that seemed heavier than usual. "GPS is acting weird though. Keeps jumping around." Grenny leaned forward from the back seat. "My compass is spinning like a damn carnival ride." Dr. Gabion frowned at his tablet. "Magnetic anomaly, perhaps? We should document this." The first thing that hit me when we reached the crash site wasn't the smell of jet fuel or the sight of twisted metal. It was the silence. No insects buzzing, no birds calling, no cattle lowing from the nearby pastures. The world had gone mute in a perfect circle roughly 500 yards across. Kelly stepped out of the lead vehicle and immediately reached for his radio. "Base, this is Investigation Team Alpha. We're on site, beginning preliminary assessment." Static answered him. Pure, white static that made my teeth ache. "Communications are down," Cowan reported, testing her own equipment. Every frequency returned the same electronic hiss. The aircraft had come down hard in what used to be a cornfield. Stalks lay flattened in radiating patterns, but not like any impact crater I'd seen before. The destruction formed perfect concentric circles, as if something had pressed down from above with tremendous, even pressure. "Where are the bodies?" Grenny asked the question we were all thinking. The cockpit section sat relatively intact about 50 yards from the main fuselage, but when I climbed up to look inside, my stomach dropped. Both pilot seats were empty, safety harnesses unbuckled and hanging loose. No blood, no signs of struggle. The men had simply vanished. "Check the passenger compartment," Kelly ordered. Same story. 24 empty seats, all restraints unfastened in the same methodical way. Personal effects remained scattered about. Wallets, phones, a paperback novel open to page 47. But no people. Dr. Gabion called out from near the wing section. "You need to see this." I jogged over to find him kneeling beside what should have been standard burn damage from the fuel ignition. Instead, the metal showed circular scorch marks about 3 feet in diameter, burned so precisely they looked laser cut. The patterns repeated across the entire aircraft surface. These aren't fire damage, Gabian said, running his fingers along the edge of one mark. The metal's been altered at a molecular level. This kind of precision. It's not possible with conventional technology. Not possible how? Kelly demanded. The heat required to create this effect would have vaporized the entire aircraft. Yet it only affected specific areas, in perfect geometric patterns. It defies physics. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October wind. In 9 years of crash investigations, I'd learned that when something defied physics, you were usually looking at something that shouldn't exist. Cowan's voice cracked over the radio. Sarge, you might want to see this. I found her 30 yards from the main wreckage, standing over something that made my blood run cold. Imprinted in the soft earth was a circle of dead grass, about 20 feet across. Within that circle, every insect, every worm, every microscopic organism had died simultaneously. The soil itself looked gray, lifeless. It's like something sucked the life right out of the ground, she whispered. That's when I noticed our equipment behaving strangely. Grenae's metal detector emitted a constant low whine. Gabian's radiation detector clicked sporadically. My watch had stopped at exactly 11:47, though my phone showed 2:23 p.m. We should call this in, Kelly said, but his radio produced only that same teeth-grinding static. The sun began its descent toward the horizon as we documented the impossible. No bodies, no reasonable explanation for the circular burn patterns, no logical cause for the electromagnetic anomalies. Just questions that multiplied like cancer cells. As darkness approached, Kelly made the decision that sealed our fate. We're staying overnight, full perimeter watch. Something happened here, and we're going to figure out what. If I'd known what was coming, I would have grabbed my team and run as far from that cursed field as our vehicles could carry us. But I was still thinking like a rational man in a rational world, still believing that every mystery had a logical explanation. The first watch passed quietly. Grenae and I took the initial shift, while the others tried to rest in our temporary camp near the tree line. The October night brought a bone-deep cold that seemed to seep up from the earth itself. Our portable heaters struggled against it, as if the very air resisted warmth. At 02:30 hours, everything changed. It started as a vibration in the ground, so subtle I thought it might be a distant train. But the trembling intensified, and I realized it was coming from above. The stars began to dim one by one, as if something vast was moving across them. Grenae, I hissed, shaking him awake from his doze. Look up. The thing that descended from the Kansas sky defied every category my mind tried to assign it. Not an aircraft. It moved too smoothly, too silently. Not natural. Its geometry was too perfect, too alien. It was a disk of light, perhaps 200 feet across, that seemed to bend reality around its edges. The electromagnetic interference hit us like a physical wave. Our radios died with electronic screams. Vehicle engines sputtered and stopped. Even our flashlights flickered and dimmed. "Wake the others!" I shouted, but my voice seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened. Kelly stumbled from his tent, took one look at the descending craft, and reached for his sidearm. The weapon fell from nerveless fingers as a column of brilliant white light erupted from the disk's center, bathing our entire camp in radiance that burned without heat. That's when the paralysis began. My legs went rigid first, muscles locking in place despite every command my brain screamed at them. Then my arms, my torso, until I stood frozen like a statue while my mind remained horrifyingly alert. Around me, my team suffered the same fate. Cowan's mouth hung open in a silent scream. Gabian had collapsed mid-step, his body rigid as a board. Kelly's eyes tracked frantically, the only part of him still mobile. The light intensified until it seemed to penetrate every cell in my body. I felt myself rising, though my feet never left the ground. The sensation was indescribable, like being lifted by invisible hands while every atom of my being vibrated at frequencies that human flesh was never meant to endure. Below me, the Kansas farmland shrank away. I could see my teammates rising alongside me, their bodies as motionless as mine, their eyes reflecting the same terror I felt. We were insects caught in amber, specimens being collected by something that viewed us as less than human. The last thing I saw before the light consumed everything was Grenet's face. Tears streamed down his cheeks, and his lips moved in what might have been a prayer or a goodbye to a wife he'd never see again. Then the world disappeared, and I learned that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Cold. That was the first sensation that pierced through the fog of consciousness. A cold so profound it seemed to leach the warmth from my very soul. My eyes opened to a ceiling that defied comprehension. A surface that appeared both metallic and organic, pulsing with veins of bioluminescent light that hurt to look at directly. I tried to move and discovered I was naked, strapped to what felt like a surgical table made of some seamless, pearl-white material. The restraints weren't metal or leather. They felt alive, warm and slightly yielding, like being held by muscular tentacles that tightened whenever I struggled. "Owen?" The voice was barely a whisper, but I recognized it immediately. "Cowan?" I turned my head as far as the organic restraints would allow. She lay on an identical table perhaps 10 feet to my right, her dark hair matted with sweat, her eyes wide with terror I'd never seen in our 9 months working together. Where are we?" she asked, though we both knew the answer would be something our minds couldn't fully accept. The room, if you could call it that, stretched beyond my field of vision in all directions. The walls curved impossibly, creating a space that seemed both vast and claustrophobic. The air tasted metallic, with an underlying sweetness that made my stomach churn. Worst of all was the sound, a low rhythmic thrumming that I gradually realized was the heartbeat of whatever structure contained us. "Kelly? Grenet? Gabion?" I called out, desperate to know my team was alive. "Here." Kelly's voice came from somewhere behind me, strained but recognizable. "Grenet's here too. Can't see Gabion." Before I could respond, the organic walls began to iris open with wet, sliding sounds that raised every hair on my body. What entered the chamber would have driven me insane if my mind hadn't already begun fragmenting from the sheer impossibility of our situation. They were roughly humanoid in shape, but that's where any resemblance to humanity ended. Standing perhaps 7 feet tall, their skin was a translucent gray that revealed the dark circulatory system beneath. Their heads were elongated, almost teardrop-shaped, with large black eyes that reflected our terror like obsidian mirrors. No visible ears, nose reduced to mere slits, and a mouth that was nothing more than a thin line that never seemed to open. 3 of them glided into the room with movements that were too fluid, too precise. They carried instruments that looked grown rather than manufactured, devices that pulsed with the same bioluminescent patterns as the walls. The nearest one approached my table, and I caught my first full glimpse of its face. Those black eyes weren't empty. Intelligence moved behind them, ancient and utterly alien. When it raised one of its instruments, a device that resembled a metallic flower with writhing petals, I understood with crystalline clarity that I was about to experience something far worse than death. The device touched my forehead, and my world exploded into memories I didn't know I possessed. I was 5 years old again, hiding in my bedroom closet while my parents fought downstairs. The fear, the helplessness, the way my small body shook with each shouted word. It all crashed over me with the intensity of living it for the first time. But this wasn't just remembering. Somehow, the device was extracting the emotions, bottling them like wine. Then I was 12, standing over my grandfather's coffin, trying not to cry because Dad said men don't cry. The grief hit me like a physical blow, but magnified 100-fold. The alien presence in my mind seemed to feed on it, growing stronger as I grew weaker. High school graduation, the pride on my mother's face. My first day in the Air Force, the terror of basic training. The night I held my sister Sarah while she cried about her divorce. Every joy, every fear, every moment of love or loss was torn from my mind and examined like specimens under a microscope. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time had no meaning in that place. The memory extraction continued with methodical precision. First childhood, then adolescence, then adulthood. They seemed particularly interested in moments of extreme emotion. The death of my childhood dog, my first kiss, the night I almost died in a training accident. Through it all, I could hear my teammates undergoing the same torture. Cowan's sobs as they forced her to relive her brother's overdose.
Kelly's anguished cries as they extracted memories of soldiers he'd lost in Afghanistan. Greney's screams when they found his fear of enclosed spaces and amplified it until he begged for death. But the worst part wasn't the pain. It was the gradual realization that we weren't the first. Other tables filled the spaces between us, some occupied by figures I didn't recognize. Men and women in various states of consciousness, their eyes vacant, drool running from slack mouths. How long had they been here? How long would we be here? The answer came when they brought in Dr. Gabion. I barely recognized our team's aerospace engineer. His hair had gone completely white, and his eyes held the hollow stare of someone who had seen too much. They carried him like a mannequin, his limbs loose and unresponsive. "Alan!" I tried to call out, but my voice was barely a croak. Days of screaming had reduced it to a whisper. He turned his head toward me with mechanical precision, and when he spoke, his voice carried no emotion whatsoever. "They've been studying us for decades, Owen. Taking people, learning about us. We're not the first team to disappear, and we won't be the last." "What do they want?" Cowan asked, her voice breaking. Gabion's empty stare fixed on something beyond the walls. "They're preparing for something. An invasion, maybe, or colonization. They need to understand how we think, how we feel, how we break. We're specimens in the ultimate behavioral study." That's when I noticed the scar at the base of his skull. A thin, silver line that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. An implant of some kind, buried deep in his brain tissue. "They gave you something," I said. He nodded slowly. "Enhanced cognitive processing. I can see patterns now, connections that weren't visible before. Mathematical relationships in the quantum foam. The underlying structure of reality itself." His voice carried a note of wonder that was somehow more terrifying than his previous emptiness. "But the cost, Owen, they took everything that made me human. My love for my wife, my joy in discovery, even my fear of death. I'm a living computer now, nothing more." The implications hit me like ice water. This wasn't just about studying us. They were modifying us, turning us into something else. My worst fears were confirmed when they came for Greney. Two of the gray beings approached his table with a new set of instruments, devices that looked more like surgical tools than the memory extractors they'd used on us. Greney fought against his restraints with desperate strength, but the organic bonds only tightened in response. "No! Whatever you're going to do it to me instead!" I screamed, though I knew it was useless. They ignored my pleas completely. The first incision was made with a tool that seemed to cut through flesh and bone like they were paper. Greney's scream echoed through the chamber, a sound that would haunt me for whatever remained of my life. I was forced to watch as they methodically disassembled my teammate. Not quickly, not mercifully, but with the same clinical precision they'd shown during the memory extractions. They removed his limbs first, cauterizing the wounds to keep him conscious. Then they opened his chest cavity, examining his heart while it still beat. The worst part was his eyes. Even as they performed their gruesome work, Greney remained aware, his gaze finding mine across the chamber. I saw him mouth the words, "Tell my wife," before they finally reached his brain. They extracted it with the same care a jeweler might show handling a precious stone, placing the still-living tissue in a translucent container filled with glowing fluid. The brain continued to function, electrical impulses sparking across its surface like tiny lightning storms. Greney's body convulsed once, then lay still. But his brain kept thinking, kept experiencing, trapped forever in a prison of alien technology. I vomited until there was nothing left, then dry-heaved until my ribs felt ready to crack. Beside me, Cowan had lapsed into catatonic shock, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, no longer seeing anything at all. "This is what they do," Gabion said in his emotionless voice. "They're building a library of human consciousness. Every thought, every memory, every neural pathway cataloged and preserved. We're not prisoners. We're books being read and then shelved." The beings returned their attention to me, and I knew my time had come. But instead of the surgical instruments, they brought something different. A device that looked like a metallic spider with multiple injection appendages. They positioned it at the base of my skull, and I felt the sharp stings as multiple needles penetrated my skin.
Whatever they injected burned like liquid fire, racing through my nervous system with unstoppable momentum. The changes began immediately. My vision sharpened until I could see individual dust motes floating in the air. My hearing became so acute that I could distinguish the separate heartbeats of everyone in the chamber. But most disturbing of all was the new sense that awakened, an awareness of the electromagnetic fields surrounding every living thing. And with that awareness came power. I didn't understand it at first, this ability to manipulate the very forces that bound matter together. It started as a tingling in my fingertips, then grew into something I could direct, focus, weaponize. The restraints holding me to the table weren't alive after all. They were some form of programmable matter, held together by electromagnetic bonds. Bonds I could now perceive, and more importantly, disrupt. With a thought, I dissolved the restraints and sat up for the first time in days. The gray beings turned toward me, those black eyes registering what might have been surprise. One of them raised a device that hummed with threatening energy. I reached out with my new ability and crushed the device like an aluminum can. The being holding it stumbled backward, and for the first time, I saw something like fear in those ancient eyes. "Cowan!" I called out, but she didn't respond. Whatever they'd done to her had broken something fundamental in her mind. Kelly was more responsive. "Owen, how did you—" "I don't know," I admitted, dissolving his restraints with the same thought-based manipulation. "But we're getting out of here." That's when I saw Captain Kelly for the first time since our abduction, and my heart nearly stopped. They'd been experimenting on him too, but in a different way. His body had been augmented, muscles bulging with unnatural size. Tubes and wires had been grafted into his skin, pulsing with the same bioluminescent patterns as the walls. His eyes glowed with an inner fire that spoke of enhanced reflexes and inhuman strength. "I can feel them in my head," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that human vocal cords shouldn't produce. "The implants. They're trying to control me, but something's fighting back." The beings were regrouping now, more of them flowing into the chamber with purpose that suggested we'd triggered some kind of alarm. But they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd given us abilities without fully understanding how we might use them. I helped Kelly to his feet, and together we moved toward Cowan's table. She was still catatonic, but alive. Gabion watched us with that same empty stare, making no move to escape his restraints. "Come with us," I urged him. He shook his head slowly. "I can't. They've shown me too much. The universe is far stranger and more terrible than you can imagine. There are things out there that make these beings look like children playing with toys. At least here, I have purpose." More beings entered the chamber, and these were different, larger, more predatory in appearance. They carried weapons that crackled with energy I could feel even from across the room. "Time to go," Kelly growled, his enhanced muscles tensing for action. That's when the walls began to iris open, revealing not an exit, but an arena. The floor was a circle of the same organic material, surrounded by tiers of seating filled with gray beings watching us with clinical interest. We weren't escaping. We were being moved to the next phase of their experiment. As they herded us toward the arena entrance, I caught a glimpse of what waited inside. Two figures stood in the center of the circle, and my blood turned to ice when I recognized one of them. It was Cowan, but not the broken, catatonic woman I'd just tried to save. This version of her stood tall and confident, her body modified with the same augmentations as Kelly's. But her eyes held an intelligence that was no longer entirely human. The other figure was something that had once been human, but was now so changed that species classification seemed pointless. It stood 9 feet tall, its limbs elongated and jointed in ways that defied anatomy. Multiple eyes had been grafted into its skull, and its mouth had been replaced with a proboscis that writhed with its own life. I understood then what the beings wanted. They hadn't just been studying us, they'd been preparing us, modifying us, creating weapons out of human flesh and bone. And now they wanted to see how well their weapons performed against each other. The arena doors sealed behind us with finality that spoke of no return. Kelly and I stood in that terrible circle, knowing that only one of us would leave alive. The transformed thing that had once been human, let out a sound that was part roar, part electronic screech. The modified Cowans smiled with predatory hunger. And in the stands above us, hundreds of gray beings leaned forward to watch the show they'd orchestrated with such meticulous care. I looked at Kelly, saw my own understanding reflected in his inhuman eyes. We weren't prisoners anymore. We were gladiators in an arena we'd never escape, fighting for the entertainment of beings who viewed us as nothing more than sophisticated toys. The games were about to begin. The arena floor trembled as the modified Cowan circled us with predatory grace. Her augmented body moved with mechanical precision, every step calculated for maximum intimidation. But it was her eyes that truly horrified me. They held intelligence, but it was cold, alien, completely devoid of the warmth I'd known in my teammate. Kelly's enhanced muscles coiled as the creature that had once been human let out another electronic screech. The thing stood 9 feet tall now, its elongated limbs jointed in ways that defied anatomy. Where its face should have been, multiple eyes blinked in sequence, while its mouth had been replaced with a writhing proboscis that dripped phosphorescent fluid. "You understand now, don't you, Owen?" the Cowan thing said, tilting its head at an unnatural angle. "This is evolution. This is what your species becomes when properly guided." "That's not evolution," I spat, fighting back waves of nausea. "That's butchery." She laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with digital static. "Sentiment. How charmingly primitive." Charmingly. The collective has moved beyond such limitations. The creature launched itself at Kelly without warning, its metallic claws extending like switchblades. Kelly caught it mid-leap, his augmented strength allowing him to grapple with the thing, but I could see he was struggling. The modifications they'd made to him were impressive, but this creature was something else entirely. A perfect fusion of human consciousness and alien biotechnology. I reached out with my newfound abilities, trying to disrupt the creature's nervous system like I had with my restraints. The power flowed through me, electromagnetic energy bending to my will, but the moment I struck, agony exploded through my skull. The implant they'd put in my brain wasn't just an enhancement, it was a leash. "Interference detected," announced a voice that seemed to come from the arena walls themselves. "Combat parameters reset. Contestant abilities unlocked." Suddenly the pain vanished, and I felt my power surge back stronger than before. But I understood now. They were controlling everything. Every ability they'd given me, every enhancement, was part of their grand experiment. We weren't prisoners fighting for freedom. We were lab rats performing for their amusement. The Cowan thing struck while I was distracted, her fist connecting with my ribs and sending me sprawling across the arena floor. The impact would have shattered bones in my old body, but the modifications they'd made gave me inhuman durability. I rolled to my feet, tasting blood, but still functional. "Come now, Owen," she taunted, advancing slowly. "Show them what you've learned. Show them how their human weapons perform." Human weapons. The words hit me like ice water. That's what we were now. Weapons they'd forged from human flesh and consciousness. But weapons for what purpose? Kelly managed to slam the creature into the arena wall, but it twisted free and raked its claws across his chest. The wounds glowed with the same bioluminescent properties as everything else in this nightmare realm. And I realized they weren't just physical damage. They were transmitting something into his system. "The nanites," Kelly gasped, his voice becoming more distorted with each word. "They're changing me. I can feel them spreading." The creature's proboscis extended toward Kelly's throat, and I acted without thinking. My electromagnetic pulse hit at full force, disrupting its bioelectrical systems long enough for Kelly to break free. But the effort left me dizzy, the implant in my skull burning like molten metal. "Impressive," the Cowan thing said approvingly. "Your species shows remarkable adaptability. No wonder the collective chose you for the harvest protocols." "Harvest protocols?" Her smile was no longer even remotely human. "Did you think this was random? Your aircraft accident in Kansas was precisely orchestrated. We've been monitoring your team for months, studying your psychological profiles, your combat effectiveness, your potential for enhancement. You were selected." The implications crashed over me like a tsunami. Everything we'd been through, The crash investigation, the electromagnetic anomalies, even our specific team composition. It had all been planned. We weren't victims of chance. We were specifically chosen targets. "Why us?" I demanded, even as I dodged another strike from her enhanced fists. "Because you represent the ideal baseline for human consciousness modification. Military training provides discipline and combat effectiveness. Investigative experience gives you analytical thinking. Emotional bonds create exploitable weaknesses." She paused to land a blow that sent me reeling. "You are the perfect prototype for what humanity will become." Kelly let out a roar that was part human agony, part electronic interference. The nanites were working faster now, visible as silver threads spreading beneath his skin. His eyes began to glow with the same cold light I'd seen in the beings that held us captive. "Fight it!" I shouted, but I could see him losing the battle. The intelligence behind his eyes was changing, becoming something else. The creature seized the opportunity, wrapping its elongated arms around Kelly's torso and beginning to squeeze. I heard ribs crack, saw blood foam at his lips, and something primal took over in my mind. I stopped trying to use my abilities the way they expected and instead focused on pure, undirected rage. Not the controlled electromagnetic manipulation they'd programmed into me, but raw fury channeled through alien technology. The implant screamed warnings, but I pushed past the pain and reached deeper into the power they'd given me. The arena lights exploded in showers of sparks. The organic walls began to convulse as their bioelectrical systems overloaded. Even the beings in the stands let out sounds of alarm as their viewing equipment went dark, but the feedback nearly killed me. Blood poured from my nose, my ears, my eyes. The implant felt like it was burning a hole through my brain. Yet somehow, I maintained the surge long enough for Kelly to break free from the creature's grip. He snapped its neck with his enhanced strength, the satisfying crack echoing through the chaos. The thing collapsed, its multiple eyes going dark one by one, but the nanites in Kelly's system were still spreading. "Owen," he said, his voice now carrying harmonics that made my teeth ache. "I can hear them, in my head. They're trying to connect me to something vast. The collective." I understood now what Gabion had meant when he said they'd taken everything that made him human. They weren't just creating weapons. They were building a network, linking enhanced human consciousness into their larger collective mind. "I won't let that happen," I said, reaching out with my abilities not to harm Kelly, but to sever the nanite connections forming in his brain. It was like performing surgery with a sledgehammer. The electromagnetic pulses I generated were too crude, too powerful for the delicate work needed. But somehow, miraculously, I managed to disrupt enough of the nanite network to give Kelly back control. He collapsed to his knees, gasping. The silver threads beneath his skin had gone dark, inactive. "Thank you," he whispered. The Cowan thing watched our struggle with apparent fascination. "Remarkable. You continue to exceed parameters. The collective will be most pleased with this data." "The collective can go to hell," I snarled. "An impossibility," she replied. "The collective exists across multiple dimensional states. Your concept of hell is merely a primitive attempt to process incomprehensible suffering." That's when I felt it. Another presence touching my mind. But this one was different from the cold, analytical intelligence of the collective. This one carried warmth, sadness, and something that felt almost like hope. "You have shown remarkable resistance to integration," the voice said. "This is unexpected." "Who are you?" I thought back. "I am designated Observer 7749, though I once had a name your species could pronounce. I have been monitoring your progress since your arrival." Images flooded my mind. Not the violent memory extraction the other beings had performed, but gentle sharing of information. I saw the being's history, its role in the collective, and most importantly, its growing doubts about their methods. "You're not like the others," I realized. "I am divergent. A flaw in the system, you might say. The collective believes consciousness can be perfected through unity, but observing your species has shown me that chaos, individuality, and even suffering serve purposes that our collective mind cannot comprehend." "Then help us escape." I cannot directly interfere. But I can offer you something else. A choice the collective did not intend to provide. The arena was stabilizing around us, other beings moving to restore order. The Cowan thing stood patiently, apparently waiting for some predetermined signal to continue the combat. What kind of choice? I asked. The enhancement process is not irreversible, but it requires sacrifice. I can return you to your world, restore you to your original state, but the knowledge of what you've experienced will remain. You will know the truth about what lies beyond your sky, but you will have no special abilities to combat it. And if I refuse, you complete the integration process. Become one with the collective. Your consciousness will be preserved, but subsumed into the greater whole. You will live forever, but you will no longer be you. The choice should have been simple, but I found myself hesitating. The power flowing through me was intoxicating. With these abilities, I could potentially protect Earth from future incursions. But at what cost? What about Kelly? He must choose for himself. I looked at my teammate, saw him struggling to his feet despite the trauma his body had endured. The nanites were dormant, but still present in his system. He would always be partially connected to their technology now. Kelly, I said aloud, we have a way out, but there's a price. His eyes focused on me with effort. What kind of price? I explained what Observer 7749 had offered. Kelly listened in silence, his enhanced features processing the information within human speed. If we go back normal, he said finally, how do we warn people? How do we prepare them for what's coming? It was the same question I'd been asking myself. The being in my mind provided an answer. The truth has a way of spreading, even when those in power try to suppress it. Your testimony, properly placed, could begin the process of awakening your species to the reality they face. But they'll cover it up, Kelly protested. Make us disappear. Discredit us. Perhaps. Or perhaps the seeds you plant will find fertile ground in minds ready to accept a larger reality. The Cowan thing suddenly straightened, receiving some kind of signal from the beings above. Integration phase complete, she announced. Initiating final combat protocol. Whatever window of opportunity we had was closing fast. I had to make a choice, for myself and for Kelly. Send us back, I decided. Both of us. Restore us to what we were. Are you certain? The power you would surrender could serve as protection for your world, or it could corrupt us the same way it corrupted her. I glanced at the thing wearing Cowan's face. I'd rather die human than live as something else. Very well. The last thing I remembered was a flash of light that seemed to come from inside my own skull. And then, I was standing in the Kansas wheat field again, but this time in broad daylight. The transport wreckage was gone, the circle of dead earth restored to normal farmland. Kelly stood beside me, looking dazed but unmistakably human again. How long? He asked, checking his watch. I looked at mine. The hands had reset to 11:47, the exact time they'd stopped when we first encountered the electromagnetic anomalies. According to the date display, no time had passed at all, but the memories remained. Every detail of our captivity, every horror we'd witnessed, every revelation about the collective's plans for humanity. The knowledge burned in my mind like acid, but it was purely human knowledge now. No enhanced abilities, no alien technology, just the terrible truth about what lurked beyond our world. Sir, there you are! I turned to see a military convoy approaching across the field. The lead vehicle bore Colonel Curry's flag, and I felt my stomach drop. How much did the government know? How much were they complicit in what had happened to us? But as the convoy drew closer, I realized something was wrong. The soldiers weren't moving with the crisp efficiency I expected from military personnel. Their movements were too precise, too coordinated, almost... Kelly, I whispered. Run. But it was too late. The soldiers surrounded us with inhuman speed, their eyes reflecting the same cold intelligence I'd seen in the collective. They weren't human anymore, or maybe they never had been. Subjects retrieved, one of them reported into a radio that looked normal but felt wrong in ways I couldn't define. Initiating containment protocol. They sedated us with injectors that hissed like angry snakes. As consciousness faded, I heard one of them speaking in a voice that carried harmonic frequencies no human throat could produce. The experiment was more successful than projected. These specimens retained complete memory integration despite neural restoration. They will be ideal for the deep infiltration protocols. I tried to fight the drugs, tried to warn Kelly, but the chemical tide was irresistible. My last coherent thought was the horrible realization that we hadn't escaped at all. We were still part of their experiment. I woke up 3 days later in a military hospital at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. The official report said Kelly and I had been found unconscious at the crash site, suffering from smoke inhalation and minor injuries from the aircraft explosion that had killed the rest of our team. They told us Grenier and Cowan had died in the blast. Dr. Gabian was listed as missing, presumed dead. We were the only survivors of a tragic accident that had claimed 4 good people and destroyed a valuable military transport. The story was perfect, airtight, completely believable, except for the dreams. Every night I dreamed of gray corridors and surgical tables, of Grenier screaming as they took him apart piece by piece, of Cowan's face twisted into something inhuman, of Kelly fighting nanites in his bloodstream while things with too many eyes watched from the shadows. I tried to convince myself they were just trauma-induced nightmares, but they felt too real, too detailed, too consistent. And Kelly was having the same dreams. It wasn't real, he kept saying during our mandatory counseling sessions. It couldn't have been real. We were unconscious for 3 days. Gas poisoning causes hallucinations. But I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe it any more than I did. The military processed us through the standard protocols for traumatic incidents: psychological evaluation, medical clearance, reassignment to new duties. I was sent to investigate a series of aircraft malfunctions in the European theater, routine work that should have been beneath my pay grade. That's when I started noticing the patterns. Every incident I investigated had the same subtle anomalies: electromagnetic interference that didn't match any known natural phenomena, circular burn patterns on metal that couldn't be explained by conventional fire, missing personnel whose disappearances were always attributed to equipment failures or human error. And in each case, the official investigation was handled with efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. Evidence was catalogued, reports were filed, and the incidents were forgotten with bureaucratic speed that made no sense for military operations. I tried to document what I was seeing, but my reports kept getting lost in the system. My photographs of evidence would develop blank, even when I was certain I'd captured something significant. My digital files would corrupt overnight, requiring me to start my documentation from scratch. It was Kelly who finally said what we were both thinking. "They're still watching us," he said during one of our clandestine meetings in a Berlin cafe. "Everything we see, everything we investigate, it's all connected to what happened in Kansas." "But we don't remember Kansas," I pointed out. "Not really, just dreams and impressions." "Then maybe that's the point," he said quietly. "Maybe the dreams are supposed to feel unreal. Maybe they want us to doubt ourselves." That night, alone in my quarters, I made a decision that would change everything. If they were monitoring my official activities, maybe it was time to start working off the books. I began investigating the aircraft incidents on my own time, using contacts I'd made over 9 years in the Air Force. What I found terrified me more than any nightmare. The incidents weren't random. They formed a pattern across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. A systematic harvest of military personnel with specific skill sets. Communication specialists, ordnance disposal experts, aerospace engineers, and accident investigators. People like my team. People like me. But the truly horrifying part was the timeline. The incidents had been happening for years, with a frequency that suggested they were part of some larger operation. How many teams like ours had vanished? How many soldiers had been taken, modified, and returned with no memory of what had happened to them? And how many of those returned soldiers were now in positions of authority within the military itself? 6 months after Kansas, I was deployed to a conflict zone in Eastern Europe. The mission briefing was standard: investigate reports of advanced enemy weaponry being used against NATO forces. But something about the deployment felt wrong from the beginning. The transport to the combat zone was strangely quiet. The other soldiers barely spoke, moving with that same uncanny coordination I'd seen in the fake convoy that had captured us in Kansas. When I tried to engage them in conversation, their responses were perfectly normal but felt rehearsed. Kelly wasn't on the mission. He'd been reassigned to a different theater, splitting up our surviving team members with surgical precision. I was alone among people who might not be people at all. The forward operating base was a nightmare of efficiency. Every soldier moved with mechanical precision. Every order was followed without question. Every operation proceeded according to protocols that seemed designed more for data collection than military effectiveness. And the enemy we were fighting? They used weapons that generated the same electromagnetic anomalies I'd been tracking across 3 continents. Weapons that left circular burn patterns on metal and made electronic equipment fail in precisely the same ways I'd documented in my investigations. I was watching a war between 2 factions of the same alien collective, fought with human soldiers who didn't know they were being controlled. That's when my training really began. It started with a sensation I'd felt before, an itching in my skull, right where I imagined an implant might be placed. Then came the enhancement of my senses, the ability to perceive electromagnetic fields, the growing awareness that I could manipulate technology with my thoughts. The abilities they'd taken away were coming back, but slowly, carefully, as if my brain was being gradually prepared for something bigger. During a firefight outside a bombed-out factory, everything crystallized. Enemy forces had our unit pinned down with weapons that shouldn't exist, firing energy bursts that turned cover into vapor and soldiers into ash. Our communications were down, our vehicles disabled by some kind of electromagnetic pulse. We were going to die unless someone did something impossible. So I stopped pretending to be normal. The power flowed through me like molten lightning. Every electromagnetic field within a mile radius suddenly under my control. Enemy weapons overloaded and exploded in their users' hands. Their vehicles went dead as I shorted out their electrical systems. Even their body armor, which I now realized was some kind of advanced technology, failed as I disrupted the energy patterns that powered it. In 30 seconds, I turned a losing battle into a complete rout. The other soldiers stared at me with expressions that weren't quite surprise, weren't quite fear, but something in between. Like they'd been expecting this, but were still amazed to see it happen. "Well done, Sergeant Ryder," said Lieutenant Morrison, the unit commander who'd been silent through most of the deployment. "You're ready for the next phase." The next phase turned out to be a revelation that shattered what remained of my sanity. I wasn't being watched by the aliens. I wasn't being manipulated by some external force. I wasn't even fighting against an invasion. I was the invasion. The memories came flooding back all at once. Not the confused dreams I'd been having, but clear, detailed recollections of everything that had happened since Kansas. The abduction, the experiments, the modifications, the choice that Observer 7749 had offered me. I hadn't chosen to return to Earth as a normal human. I'd chosen to become their weapon. The electromagnetic abilities, the enhanced senses, the growing detachment from human emotion, it was all part of their design. They'd sent me back not as a victim, but as an agent. A sleeper weapon activated by exposure to the right stimuli. And I wasn't alone. Kelly was somewhere in Asia, using his enhanced strength and modified physiology to destabilize a government that had been resisting alien influence. Gabion, who I now remembered had never actually died, was in South America, his enhanced intelligence helping to design technology that would make humanity more dependent on systems the collective could control. Even Cowan was out there somewhere, her consciousness subsumed into the collective mind, but her body serving as a perfect infiltrator among human populations. We were a virus, spread across the globe, designed to weaken humanity's resistance from within. But they'd made one crucial error in their planning. They'd assumed that consciousness could be completely rewritten, that human identity could be erased and replaced with something more useful. They were wrong. Deep beneath the alien programming, beneath the modified neural pathways and the enhanced abilities, the real Owen Ryder was still there, buried, suppressed, but alive. And he was furious. The war they thought they were winning was about to become a lot more complicated. But that's a story for another day. For now, all you need to know is that the soldiers fighting your wars, the investigators studying your mysteries, the engineers designing your future, some of us aren't entirely human anymore. Some of us are weapons in a conflict you don't even know you're fighting. And some of us are planning to make sure humanity wins, no matter what it costs us personally. The real war is just beginning.